Today we're going to talk about a handgun that could be considered the Springfield XD killer. Talking about the BRG9 from BRG-USA. Let's go. What's up, crew? It's Chris with CloverTac, and welcome back to the channel. Not going to waste any time today. My eyes are on, my ears are in. Let's put a few rounds down range. 10 yards down range, got one of our 6-inch steel gongs from high caliber targets. Here we go. Now, if you're thinking, wow, that BRG9 looks really familiar, well, it's probably because it shares a lot, at least aesthetically, with the Springfield XD line of handguns. Now, before we go to the bench to compare some of the features between the BRG9 and the XD9, it's important to note out that my Springfield XD9 was one of the first to come out. I've had it for many years. There's thousands of rounds through it, and I've never had any issues. But we've also got to talk about two quick elephants in the room if we're going to compare the BRG9 to the XD9. The first is the price point. BRG9 comes in at a much lower MSRP than the Springfield XD. If you're out there and you're a staunch 2A supporter, well, you probably don't like some of the anti-2A shenanigans Springfield has pulled in the past as well. So that's two marks right out of the box against the Springfield XD. Here we are on the bench before we get started. No ammunition is around. Just going to double check both of these handguns, make sure everything is good to go. That means checking the mags and also checking the chamber. Everything looks good. Speaking of the magazines, we'll start out with that by saying both of the magazines, the BRG9 as well as the XD9, going to have 15 round magazines in here. There are some interesting things about the compatibility on the magazines, but I want to cover that out on the range, so we'll talk about that a little later on. Let's talk a little bit about the similarities and the differences when it comes to these two handguns. You can see aesthetically, as far as the design, very similar. Dimensions, not going to get into the specifics here, but very, very close as far as width and height and length is concerned. Now, with the weight, the BRG9 does come in 2 ounces heavier, and I think there's a reason for that we'll cover a little bit later on. Now, let's walk through these from tip to grip, so to speak. We're going to start with the slides, and you can see a very similar design as far as the cuts and that sort of thing on the slides. One thing to keep in mind, and at the end of this video, I will have the podcast with Ken from BRG-USA linked. He talked about the difference in steel that BRG-USA uses, a higher grade steel, as opposed to most firearms manufacturers today. So that was really interesting. Now, does the upgraded, let's say, steel that's used in all the components, the steel components of the BRG9, does that make a difference in weight? Is there a difference in the weight on different classification of steel? I can't tell you, possibly, but if we notice here, the XD9 has that cutout more or less in the slide that runs all the way down, and you don't have that on the BRG9, meaning you've got a much beefier slide, especially on this back side, and that more steel, of course, a beefier slide could play into that 2 ounce difference in the weight. Now, if we look at the slide cuts, the cocking serrations, got more cocking serrations on the front of the BRG9 for sure, but a little bit more on the back as well. I know that's important to some people. And there are a couple of safety features, mechanisms, whatever you want to call it, on both of these that are very similar. On the top right here, you've got a chamber indicator, a loaded chamber indicator. So if there was a round in there, this little piece would pop up. And then you've got a striker cocking indicator. So when that striker is cocked, that little pin will stick out. You have that exact same feature on the XD9 as you do on that BRG9. Now, while we're in the slide area, we can talk about sights. Now, keep in mind, my example of the XD9 as well as the BRG9 are my examples. And with almost any firearm out there on the market, they are available with a variety of different types of sights. In this particular situation, I much prefer the BRG9 sights over the XD9. The XD9, you'll notice, is just got this rear sight that just juts straight up from the slide. It's got no aesthetically pleasing look to it or anything like that. And it is a 3 white dot, 2 white rear dots, 1 white front dot on a standard front ramp sight. Those sights are, of course, removable. You got removable sights on the BRG9 as well, but that rear sight is the biggest difference. It is a ramped style rear sight. Looks a whole lot better. And it's got 2 white dots in the rear and a contrasting orange dot on the front. And I do like the contrast. I do like that ramped rear sight. Now we got to flip the firearms over for this next part. So we'll flip these dudes over because I do want to show a difference in the extractor. With the BRG9, you've got almost a Glockish, I guess, style extractor system here. And notice you've got no exposed extractor system on the XD9 here. And again, looking at the slide profile and the way all of that is cut out, again, very similar. Now moving down to the grip frame, starting at the front on both of these, they both have a rail for a light, whatever type of accessory. The BRG9 is more of a Picatinny style spacing on the 2 slots on the rail, where the 2 slots on the rail with the XD are a little bit further apart. Moving back on the grip frame, we've got another thing that I like about the BRG9 as opposed to the XD9, and that's the takedown lever here. Now, both of these are the same size. You've got the serrations or whatever are all the way across on the BRG9, where it's only about 3/4 of the way or so on the XD9. But there's 2 things about this. First thing, on the BRG9, this takedown lever, in order to pull it down, field strip, get the slide off, this lever moves down. And I like that design much better than the design of the XD9, where this goes up, because this goes up and you're trying to pull the slide off, and that's going up in the way potentially of your thumbs and your fingers trying to manipulate and get the slide off. The other thing is that the takedown on the XD9 is just attached almost like an afterthought to the outside of the grip frame, where there was some thought put into the BRG9 here, and it's recessed. You can see this recessed area down into the grip frame. So where the takedown lever on the XD9 adds to the overall width and could get hung up, makes a sharp point or at least a hang up area there, you've got almost a smooth transition here with the takedown on the BRG9. Now moving on back, we've got the slide lock, slide stop lever. You can notice right away the BRG9 much larger than the XD9. Now the XD9 here a lot older than my example of the BRG9, many more rounds through it, and you would think it would be wore in and it would be easier to release than the BRG9, but it's not. But they sort of pride themselves on this slide lock, slide release being really easy to manipulate, and it is right out of the box, better than even the XD9 is today, with potentially thousands of rounds through it. Moving back to the complete backside of the grip frame, you've got the beaver tail area, and it extends well past the slide, and is rounded off on the BRG9. So if you like that extended beaver tail style design, that's going to appeal to you. I personally like that. The XD9 here does stop short. It comes just past the slide and then almost drops off at a 90-degree a straight angle. Both of these having, of course, the external grip safety. Nothing really different about them there. But moving back across the grip frame, you can see you've got your little thumb ledge, thumb rest, finger rest on this. It's present on the opposite side of this XD9 as well. And it's just a little grooved out spot where your thumb can rest while you're gripping. And at first look, you may think the BRG9 doesn't have that, but this is dipped out all the way across the grip frame right here. It's the same theory, but they just extended it to this entire section on both sides. So that could be a lot better than this smaller area if you've got, of course, bigger hands. Moving down to the mag release, it's almost the same exact magazine release on these. But one thing I do like is the transition between that magazine release area on the BRG9 here is a lot smoother in its transition than the XD9. The XD9 is almost kind of choppy. It just falls off at a sharp angle and goes into that trigger guard. And I just think the BRG9 looks a little better. Now, an obvious difference here is going to be the trigger. So let's talk about that. You've got a straight trigger on the BRG9. You've got a curved trigger on the XD9. Both of them have the little dingus in the front. And as far as the trigger, the actual pull weight of the trigger is very similar on both of these. Not a whole lot of difference. Honestly, not a whole lot of difference on the trigger altogether. I do think that with the straight trigger on the BRG9, it's also a little bit wider than the trigger on the XD9 as well. And I think that being flat, being straight, being a little wider, it's a little better perceived feel on the trigger pull, possibly, but weight going to be about the same. It is a little bit crisper on that brake, I think, personally, than the XD9. And again, I've got many thousands of rounds, several thousand rounds easily through the XD9 and maybe a few hundred at most at this point through the BRG9. So that says a lot. You've also got less pre-travel, less take-up, it seems like, with the BRG9 than the XD9, and the reset is just a little bit shorter. So trigger, overall, is it a vast difference? No, I don't think it is, but a slight edge I would have to give to the BRG9. Now let's move to the trigger guard. Flip it up, we'll see that you've got the undercut area here. It's deeper than the XD9, and the trigger guard is fairly wide, just a little bit wider than the XD9. But if we look at the XD9 here, flip it up, notice it's a little bit thinner, of course. That undercut, not quite as pronounced. However, it's really easy to see that the thickness of the XD9, the trigger guard is a bit thicker. Moving down to the grip itself, the XD9, especially on this backstrap area, textured, which is great. But the BRG9 has interchangeable back straps. So you're going to get a small, medium, large, and you can punch out a pin, change that out. Now, that's awesome. I like that feature. One thing is, my particular BRG9 here did not come with any type of tool or a punch to knock this out. And it's weird because the BRG9 comes with some cleaning supplies and some other little things. You think they would throw $1, whatever it costs them to manufacture a little punch in there, because especially if you don't do your own gunsmithing work or stuff like that, you would not have that little punch in order to be able to knock out that pin to do what you need to do. Moving to the front side of the grip on the XD9, you can see it is flat, but it is again textured. If we look at the BRG9 here, it is textured, but it has some very mild, not over pronounced, but some very mild finger grooves. Now, I like finger grooves on a handgun, assuming, of course, it fits my hand and my fingers fall in those grooves properly. In this case, they do. Before we go out to the range to do a little more live fire and take a look at how the interchangeability or compatibility of magazines work, I do want to field strip these, and I think we should take a look at some internal components as well. So here we are, got the XD9 and the BRG9 field stripped. You'll notice those takedown levers I talked about, the BRG9 coming down, XD9 coming up. I'm going to flip these slides over, take a look inside them. And you can see the basic design on these are going to be the same. But we've got a much larger, more robust, not only barrel, but locking block and recoil guide rod system on the BRG9 than we do the XD9. Now, does that add to the weight? Again, possibly. And keep in mind, too, that anything metal, like we talked about, is supposedly, according to BRG-USA, a little higher grade. And there's another thing that I really like about the BRG9 compared to the XD9, and that is when we look inside here, we got slide rails. Those slides ride on a front and rear rail here. This entire assembly in the BRG9, front and rear, are going to be steel, that higher grade steel. Now, in contrast, the front on the Springfield XD9 here is, of course, metal. The back is polymer. So again, might add to the weight, having a little more steel on that. And I think as far as holding up over time, anytime you can get away from polymer on a part, you've obviously got steel riding in that area on both of these handguns. Why not have a high grade steel on steel instead of steel on polymer? So with that look of features here on the bench done, let's get back to the range. Here we are back out on the range. I'm going to demonstrate the mag swap, mag compatibility between these two handguns. Got the XD9 here and the BRG9 magazine. Now this fits into the magazine well super tight. It does lock up, but it's pretty doggone tight. And when we push that mag release, it does not fall free. We have to pull it out by hand. I don't like that. It shouldn't work that way. Will this function in an XD9? Maybe. Today we're not going to try that, but let me show you something. Now here is the BRG9 and the magazine from the Springfield XD. It's going to slide up in there much better. It's going to lock into place just fine. When we push that mag release, it's going to also fall out. So let's fire a few rounds with the XD magazine in the BRG9 and see how it does. Everything ran just about as good as it can be expected. So I think that is your confirmation that if you have some XD9 magazines, they will very likely fit and function properly in the BRG9. So is the new BRG9 from BRG-USA going to be the XD killer? Well, I'll let you be the judge of that. Hey, if you're looking for more content on some cool handguns, well, you know we got you covered right over here. As for this one, we're done. So thanks for hanging out. Thanks for watching. And until next time, don't forget to chain fire freedom.